called Florida in the Al Gore column.
Just moments ago, I spoke with George W. Bush and congratulated him on becoming the 43rd President of the United States. And I promised him that I wouldn't call him back this time.
Ding dong, who's there? It's learning. Hey guys, welcome back to the Election for Dummies series, Cha-Ching 2000. This is the big one, guys. The one for the record books. I'm Keith Hughes, and that's HipHughes, or Mr. Hughes, or Mr. H, or that weird guy on the internet that looks like Drew Carey. And that is Noam Chomsky. He is my facilitator as I take you through this learning experience. And we're going to cover the election of 2000. Who is this series for? Who is this video for? You're probably in a high school class. You're probably freaking out the night before the test. Or maybe you're an intro-level college course and you just don't want to look like a dummy in front of everybody in class. Or maybe you're just crazy on the internet. Either way, we would like to fill your brain with stuff. And oddly enough, I have a bag filled with stuff right there. It's got George Bush's and Al Gore's brains. So I'm going to go get it, we're going to open it up, and the learning that will ensue is just going to boggle your imagination. So I'll be right back. Giddy up. You thought I was kidding. Because I was. In this first section, what we would like to do, guys, is kind of like a bio sketch. Just the basic background of the contenders here, just so you know a little bit of where they're coming from. We'll start on the Democratic side, who is Al Gore. Al Gore is the vice president, or was the vice president for Bill Clinton. So most importantly, going into this kind of very basic, sketchy overview of the election, we need to understand that he's kind of, in the sense, the incumbent. No, he's not the president, but he carries, the vice president title with him. So that is, a lot of experience. Al Gore is the son of a senator and a former senator from the southern state of Tennessee. And one kind of oddity in the election is he's one of very few candidates who loses his home state. That's not good. I think George McGovern, 72, was the last one to lose his home seat. You just don't lose your home seat. So he's going to have some electoral problems in the South, and we'll take a look at that. His wife is Tipper Gore. And Tipper Gore, if you go back to the late 80s, was very involved in kind of record labeling and censorship, as musicians and fans saw it, of vulgar lyrics. And I think a lot on the left kind of hear Tipper Gore and they kind of freak out a little bit. So he's not a liberal Democrat in that kind of FDR mold. He's a new Democrat. We've talked about this before if you joined us for the Clinton series. And in fact, I believe Al Gore was the head of the Democratic Leadership Committee, which is a new centrist Democratic organization that seeks to move the party to the center, whether it's ideological or it's more pragmatic on an electoral level, like they're trying to get more votes from different coalitions. I don't know, but he's definitely not to the left. And when he chooses, well, first he breezes through the primary. Bill Bradley, former basketball star, kind of to the left and kind of a liberal Democrat, gave him a small challenge in New Hampshire, but Gore won Iowa easily on farmer issues. He narrowly won New Hampshire, and it was pretty much after that a done deal. He was very much the expected winner, the front runner. It really isn't a primary contest back in 1999 as Al Gore is seeking the nomination. So that's the basics on Al Gore. You should know, again, 8 years in the White House as vice president. He's a centrist Democrat, or a new Democrat. His wife has got her hands in the censorship jar a little bit, and he's from the southern state of Tennessee. So on the other side, we have George Bush's brain, and that's a little bit different. And we don't have a lot of time, so I can't go into the in-depth bio of George Bush, but you definitely should know that his father, of course, is George Bush Sr., former CIA head, and then later vice president under Ronald Reagan, and of course a one-termer from 1988 to 1992, losing to Bill Clinton in 92. So at that time, you can go back in George Bush's, history, and it's certainly interesting, and you could take a look at it, maybe Al Gore too. But needless to say, he was involved in, I think he owned the Rangers for a little while. He had some different oil ventures and companies. He ran for Congress, and I think that he lost earlier in his career. And then he was kind of adrift for a little while, and he was came back in the, I want to say probably the early 90s as governor of Texas. I think he defeated Ann Richardson. But nevertheless, he is a conservative Republican. He, believes in smaller budgets. He believes in kind of that individualism or can-do spirit. He coined the term, I believe, to compassionate conservatism, that his policies also were going to help not just the rich but the poor. And we'll take a look, like whether it's the vouchers that he kind of pushed, or he eventually is going to sign the Medicare Prescription Act, which is not a kind of Republican kind of thing to do. But nevertheless, we're not going to get too much into compassionate conservatism, but we are going to realize that he does have experience in the executive state level. Foreign policy is going to be a different story because he doesn't really have foreign policy experience. The man who ran his vice presidential nomination search team was Dick Cheney, and he chose himself. And Dick Cheney has a lot of foreign policy experience, so there is a lot of kind of neocon foreign policy experience surrounding George Bush, but not George Bush, the candidate himself. In fact, when he was asked about foreign policy, he was very critical of the Clinton administration for kind of nation building, whether it was in Somalia in '99 or Bosnia in the late 90s, 97, 98. But he was critical of nation building and kind of an aggressive foreign policy at that time. He defeats, really, there's a lot of characters that run for the Republican nomination, like Alan Keyes. I think Kane even ran back then. There was a ton of them. I know there were a ton of them. But his biggest challenger was John McCain. And of course, you know John McCain from losing to Barack Obama back in 2008. Republicans very much have a tradition of kind of the next guy in line. So John McCain will be back. But John McCain gave George Bush a good run for his money. I believe he defeated George Bush in New Hampshire. And then when the strategy turned to a southern strategy down south, John McCain is definitely more of a centrist. So his policies weren't as attractive as kind of Bush's more religion kind of stuff, like values and abortion and gays and that kind of thing that kind of rallied the base in the South. There was a very kind of hotly contested charge that some of the Bush people or people connected to Bush were running kind of dirty push polls. If you're in AP government, a push poll is a poll that isn't really designed to find out what you think, but to transfer information to you, maybe an idea. So there was kind of that going on, making reference to John McCain's adopted children who were from Bangladesh, and there was a color issue, and it's kind of ugly, but definitely not saying George Bush did that, but that was kind of, like a dirty trick that kind of got some news coverage, and I think it's important to realize there's a lot of factors that go into winning the nomination that might not be as simple as a stump speech. But nevertheless, at the end of the day, we have our two contenders. We have the vice president, Al Gore, running against the Texas governor, conservative Republican, George Bush. So let's get into kind of how that race ran, what their basic big differences were, and we'll take a look at Ralph Nader too. So I am so excited. My teaching heart is imploding. So hang on to your hats, and I'm going to go grab another bag of learning. I got me a bag of learning. Oh, I hope I didn't destroy it all. Okay, guys, I really want to get to Bush v. Gore, so we got to be fair to the election series here and talk a little bit about the process, like how that election ran. Interestingly enough, it's not like really a big kind of controversial public policy election. There are differences in the candidates. There's a budget surplus back then, so a lot of what to do with that surplus. Clinton ran a surplus at the end of his term, and there's now hundreds of millions of dollars extra. And Al Gore, I believe, is more about investing that money back into the system, whether it be education, something a little bit to the left, more liberal democratic. And George Bush is saying that's the people's money, and we should give tax cuts and return that money, and kind of a supply side economic thing. So ideologically, the Republicans are Republican and the Democrats are Democrat. Other issues, like I could talk about foreign policy a little bit, education, what to do, privatization of Social Security, Medicare. So, I don't want to dive into the details of all of those programs because I bet you can guess if you're a student of political science where they stood on most of those issues, pro-life, pro-choice, all of those kinds of things. I think that what the campaign really becomes about is more of like a cult of personality. And elections have becoming like that ever since 1960, more and more. Who do you like more than what policies do you like? And I think that George Bush was more likable than Al Gore. Al Gore's kind of labeled as the out-of-touch, kind of liberal, bureaucrat, suit, really doesn't get it, stuck in his own head, doesn't understand people like me. There's flubs that are maybe exaggerated, maybe not. Makes it sound like Al Gore says, I invented the internet. I discovered Love Canal. Some of these statements, whether he said it word for word or not, once it's in, kind of in the American memory, it doesn't really matter. People are going to believe what they're going to believe. And I think this is part of kind of the hyper-pluralistic kind of nature of our media being kind of divided. People kind of listen to what they want to hear. One more thing that I should mention, and I'm just throwing this in here because I'm allowed to, is the fact that, strategically wise, something that Al Gore did that I think many political scientists, think that it was probably a mistake, and that was really to run from the Clinton record. Al Gore did not campaign with Bill Clinton. I think that he was afraid that some of the scandalous aspects of his presidency, including the impeachment, the Monica Lewinsky, kind of some of the sex scandals and that kind of stuff, was going to hurt him with religious kind of independent voters. So not only does he pick Joe Lieberman to be his vice presidential choice, Dick Cheney is George Bush's choice, but Lieberman is, I think, one of the only Democrats that I think voted for impeachment or was for kind of that trial. I'm not sure which way he voted, but he was no friend of Bill Clinton. In fact, today Joe Lieberman's an independent. Nevertheless, let's move on. Other big kind of episodes in that election that are important to know would definitely be the Ralph Nader effect. Ralph Nader is running under the Green Party, and Ralph Nader is a environmentalist, a consumer advocate, definitely to the left of Al Gore. So, and I don't want to say steal votes from Al Gore, because people, when they cast their vote for who they want to be president. But the charge, or at least the thought in political sciences, is that if Ralph Nader is not going to win the election, then a vote for him probably would have gone to Al Gore if he wasn't running. Ralph Nader is running not just to win. I think he realizes that he can't win, but he's going for the crucial 5%. Because once you receive 5%, then you're kind of entitled to federal funding for your party the next time you run. So, you're allowed to run for president. And Ralph Nader is exercising that right. And a lot of Democrats that are kind of centrist Democrats are seeing this as really stealing votes from Al Gore. In fact, I believe the Republican National Committee ran ads in swing states for Ralph Nader. And the Republicans are in favor of Ralph Nader as, vegetarians are in favor of, raw hamburger meat. So if a vegetarian group puts an ad out, buy raw hamburger meat, something else is going on. So I think Republican base, Republican committee understands that if we can convince liberal Democrats on the left side of the ideological scale to kind of, scale off from those centrist Democratic Party, then they have a better chance to coalition build and win from the center to the right. So the race ensues. There's debate performances, there's Nancy charges both ways, but we're ready for election night. So giddy up, let's go get that big map out. I'm so excited. And we'll take a look at electorally where the chips fell. So go keep your hat of learning on. Maybe you should go get a drink of water or something. John Quincy Adams, Benjamin Harrison, Rutherford B. Hayes, and George W. Bush. What do you think these four guys have in common? Because they do have something in common. 5 seconds. Think about it. You got it. They're presidents who won the Electoral College but lost the popular vote. And I don't even think that John Quincy Adams won the Electoral College. But that's an anomaly in the system. You've probably learned that if you've watched other videos or if you're in a political science class, that because of federalism and the way that the founding fathers felt about factions in the United States and kind of the threats of a pure democracy, we have an electoral system where, of course, you run in 50 states. Your state's assigned an electoral number based on your state's population, plus everybody gets 2 extra points for the kind of Senate concept and the great compromise. But nevertheless, when you win that state, almost all of the states work like this, except for a couple. You win that number, and 270 wins it. So George Bush has 271, Al Gore has 266, and it's definitely President George W. Bush. But if you look at the popular vote, Al Gore had, I think, 500,000 plus more votes. Because if you win heavily in your states, but come closer in some of the other states and lose, you can certainly come up with this math kind of anomaly. But nevertheless, let's look regionally at this map and kind of who won where and why, and then we'll take a look at the big bad boy, which is right there. You see it. How important is Florida in this election? I can't even talk about it because it makes my head implode upon itself. So electorally, this is a very kind of ideologically based kind of base map. Like parties have bases, voters that kind of show up to the polls when you need them to show up, and I think that the base got out for George Bush. In fact, if you look at this map as a cartogram map, which is a map that is based on population concentration, you can see, look at the wacky map up there. There's a lot of red because geographically there's just a lot of red in the country. The blue, you can see, is concentrated, if you look at this map, in kind of city, urban areas near coastlines. But electorally, if we look, we can see the states that George Bush won, that Bill Clinton had won. One of them being like Tennessee and Arkansas. So kind of the South goes back to being all GOP. You can see it's just a swash of red down here. So by losing those states, he had to make them up somewhere else. And he couldn't make them up. And he lost. That's what happens. Ohio goes to the Republicans. They don't think any Republican has ever won without Ohio, so that's a big state. But we still have kind of the concentration of blue where we would assume that it would be. The Northeast, except for New Hampshire, is, pure blue. So, kind of more democratic, liberal states with large urban areas. And if we look at the other side of the map, you can see over there, the whole West Coast is blue. So, Oregon and Washington and California. And other than, I think, maybe New Mexico, the map is pretty much all red. So let's talk about election night. We'll talk about the ensuing controversial sequence of events that occurred, and then we'll chalk it up to an evening of learning and fun. So I'll be right back, guys. I'm so excited I can't even believe it. Here we go. So on election night, boy, was that a mess. Election night, towards the end of the evening, what happens is that news agencies start getting results from what's called exit polls. And exit polls are not official. They're done by news agencies outside of the polling places to basically ask people who they voted for after they vote, and then they use those to project, in terms of whether they can project whether there's a winner or not. So the exit polls, I think by around 9 o'clock, right before some of the polls hadn't even closed yet, one of the stations announced that, I think it was CNN, announced that Al Gore was the president. They figured, by looking at the statistics and the math formulas going on, there was no way he wasn't going to be president. And then a few hours later, Fox News, I believe, came out and said, no, George Bush. We project George Bush to be the winner. And then throughout the evening, I think the other stations also agreed it was George Bush. I even believe that Al Gore called George Bush privately to concede, like, you won, game over. And then in the morning, when the numbers started really coming in and it became closer and closer and closer, I think it was down to like 900 votes or 1,000 votes out of, we're talking about tens of millions of votes, that it triggers an automatic recount. When you get down to like a half, like half of 1% or 0.01 or something crazy like that, you get these automatic triggers by state law. Because remember, states run elections. That's federalism. That's, kind of 10th Amendment kind of stuff. So Florida's laws stated there had to be a recount. And as the recount started to take place, the election got kind of closer and closer and closer and closer. And, by the time we're into, a couple weeks after the elections, it's down to like 500 votes or 300 votes. It's really, really close. So as that voting was happening, and there's a lot of different things we can talk about why the recount took so long. One of them was the hanging chad phenomenon, that the machines would not accept ballots that had the holes not completely punched out. So Florida came up with a system to, whether or not they were going to count the chad by how many perforated edges were kind of being hung on to, and that's a lengthy process. And there's kind of this famous image, you can see it right there, the guy's big eye looking up at it. And it just really is a slow, tedious process, and everybody kind of wants to know what's going on. So in fact, the Bush administration, not the Bush administration, but the Bush folks are actually going to the court system now to stop the counting, because they believe like their guys won, it's time to move on. We need consistency and president, and we can't have this kind of funny counting business going on. And remember, elections are for states, and then it goes up to the Florida Supreme Court, and the Florida Supreme Court reverses the lower court and says, no, you're going to keep counting, and they extend the deadline and kind of keep pushing the process. So at that point, the Bush people bring it to the next level, and you go outside of the state court system, you go to the federal court system, and they make kind of an emergency plea to the Supreme Court. You need to settle this now. So it goes to the Supreme Court, and this is Bush v. Gore. Whether or not the Florida state courts are allowed to make these types of rulings to extend the deadlines. The Secretary of State who runs the election is Kathleen Harris. I'm a Bush supporter, and she's against this. She says, we're wrapping this up. The sucker is over. And the court, the judicial branch, is saying, no, it's not over. You're going to keep counting. So nevertheless, ideologically, it's kind of like really weird, because ideologically, conservatives generally would say, let the state run its business, that this is 10th Amendment, that this isn't the kind of domain of the federal government to tell states what to do, so the state should be allowed to run its business the way the state, constitution works, which is to honor, probably the Florida Supreme Court's decision and continue the counting. Liberals, on the other hand, are more likely for intervention, an activist court, right? A looser interpretation, using federal power to gain control over state power. But here it's reversed. So in a 5-4 decision, all 5 appointees are Republican appointees, all 4 for Gore are Democratic. So it has this kind of partisan edge to it, which is probably not great for the court system and how people see it. Says no more counting, that the election is over, with an asterisk, amazingly enough, which says don't pay attention to this decision next time that you want to, this is not a precedent. And a lot of court decisions, I don't know many that say, by the way, don't do this one again because we're not going to have the same ruling. But that's it. George Bush wins, and he's the president of the United States. Now, independent analysis, if you go back and you go, well, who actually had more votes? If you went by what the Gore campaign was asking for, which is only a few counties, I think Broward County, maybe Miami-Dade County, then I don't think that he had enough votes to overtake George Bush. But if you did a state recount, like you did literally a counting of every vote, then I believe that Al Gore would have won the election. I think the number is 527. I think that's what it is. That's what number's in my head right now. That 527 votes out of tens of million votes decides the winner. So there you go. There is the election of 2000. We hope you enjoyed it. We hope you learned something. We hope that you're still alive. And we hope you join us next time when we re-elect George Bush and he beats the smarty pants off John Kerry. I'm going to go jump on a swift boat right now and row, row, row away. We hope you learned something good. Merrily, 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 HipHughes is over.